So Jesus is continuing to clash with those religious elite of his day. And in the last passage of last week, the Pharisees, they displayed their contempt at what Jesus and his disciples were doing. And if you remember, they were eating and having a party with tax collectors, with publicans and sinners. Well, in this week's passage, the issue is not what Jesus is doing, but now it's an issue of what he's not doing. He responds to their concerns with three parables. And the first addresses the surface issue. And the last two that we're going to look at get to the heart of the issue. And in a nutshell, the heart of the issue is this. If we are to come to Jesus, we must do so on his terms, not ours. Jesus had already offended the religious Jews when he publicly forgave a man's sins back in the 5th verse of the 2nd chapter. Then they got upset because he's attending this feast at Matthew's house or Levi's house in the 16th verse. And since Matthew was a tax collector, they couldn't understand why this apparently a religious Jew, being Christ, was spending time with sinners. Thus, there was a scandal that broke out over Jesus and sinners. Now, the verses that we're going to look at today open up another scandal between Jesus and the religious leaders, the Jewish leaders. This time it involves their traditions. Jesus dared to ignore their rituals, and they find themselves offended once again. Now, for myself, and I think some of you would agree with this, perhaps most of you, it seems to me that no type of person is as hard to deal with as a religious person. You take a person, when I'm saying that, I'm talking about a religious person that's held in the grip of tradition. They're held in the grip of rituals and legalism. If you step into their world and you step on their little belief system, you're soon going to discover that that religious person can be just as mean as the devil. I mean, it's crazy. It won't take but a second to see that their religion has never penetrated their heart and has brought about true salvation and godliness. And that's the kind of people Jesus is facing in these verses. He's facing criticism from a group of people who do not know God. Now, they think they do, but they do not know God. They know the rules, they know the rituals, they know the legalisms, but they do not know God. In these verses, we're going to watch the Lord, how he faces this scandal over these religious leaders' sacraments or their rituals. We hear the word sacrament quite a bit in religious circles, and it's nothing more than a mere religious ceremony or ritual. Usually folks who observe sacraments believe that the ritual brings God's favor upon those who observe this ritual. For instance, some people believe that baptism can save the soul. Our Roman Catholic friends, they observe 7 different sacraments that they believe can produce salvation. In reality, it's like I said earlier, it's Christ alone. God's salvation and blessings comes only through God's grace, period. So we're going to notice the truths that present themselves in this text. And we're going to look and see how Jesus handles his latest run-in with the Pharisees. So we're going to look first at Jesus and the rebuke. This is the rebuke that the Pharisees are giving Christ. And it observes, the first point we want to look at, it observes the ritual. The Bible says in the first part of the 18th verse, he says, "Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting." Now, when we look at this verse, we're told that the Pharisees and the disciples of John the Baptist, were known to observe fasting as part of their lifestyles. That's what's being presented here to Christ. And fasting is a time of self-denial. It's a period of denying the flesh, and we're wanting to get the attention of God, seeking the face of God. And the one who's fasting, he may refrain from eating or drinking or from other kinds of physical fulfillment for a period of time. The Pharisees, for instance, they fasted 2 days a week. And you find this in the book of Luke. They fasted every Monday and they fasted every Thursday. And they fasted for a period of time from 6 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock in the evening. Yet their fasting, and Christ called them on this, their fasting was not done in a sincere effort to seek the Lord. They actually fasted to impress God, but even more so, they fasted to impress man. The Pharisees believed that God would see their self-denial and bless their sacrifice. They also did everything they could to make sure that others knew they were fasting. You can find this in the book of Matthew. They would whiten their faces. They would put ashes on their heads. They would wear their clothes in obvious disarray. They refrained from bathing, and they tried to look as sad and mournful and miserable as possible. They wanted everyone to know what they were doing. Now, here we have the rebuke in the rest of verse 18. And came and said to him, who came and said to him? John's disciples and the Pharisees. Why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? Now, we're going to get back to verse 18. Jesus and his disciples are enjoying a feast in the house of Levi, or in the house of Matthew. Now, it's possible that this feast may have been held on Monday or Thursday. I'm kind of looking at perhaps it was. My opinion here. One of the Jewish fasting days, and this upset the Pharisees. We don't know what caused them to be upset, but that's a good reason for them to come at him at this time. But we do know they were upset. The disciples of John, they're upset also. And perhaps it's because their leader has been arrested and possibly had been killed by now, as a martyr. They're mourning the absence of John. And perhaps they're upset because Jesus is having a party, and they think Jesus perhaps ought to be mourning the situation with John also. But here's the problem. Jesus didn't keep their rules. Jesus didn't walk to the beat of their drum. These men had already decided how good people were supposed to live, and Jesus refused to allow himself to be pressed into their religious mold. And today's church needs to take kind of a page out of Jesus' playbook here. We don't want to be pressed into a denominational religious mold. We want to be up and about presenting the gospel to men and women wherever we can encounter them. It's not about being a Baptist. It's not about being a Pentecost. It's not about being a Catholic, Lutheran, Presbyterian, or the whole list of things. It's about being obedient to the call of Christ in our lives as Christians. So here we have Christ not marching to their drum. Jesus refused to allow himself to be pressed into their mold. He refused to allow dead rituals to become the focus and the face of his life and his ministry. Now, the next thing we want to look at is Jesus and his response. We see the ritual, we see the Pharisees and John's disciples rebuking Christ, and now we have the response of Jesus. And he gives an explanation in verse 19. And Jesus said to them, "Can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast." Now, Jesus here is responding to their criticism by talking about a wedding. And we're going to miss that a little bit. We kind of catch it. But weddings in those days were nothing like they are today. Now, as soon as the wedding wraps up, the newlyweds leave on their honeymoon. In Jesus' day, things were different. As soon as the ceremony was over with, in Bible time during Jesus' day, the newlyweds would host their family and friends for a whole week of celebration. I mean, it was party time. They would spend 7 days feasting and being treated like a king and a queen. Life in those days, And during those times, the desert lands, they were difficult at best. We cannot appreciate that folks during that time, they got up and worked from sun up till it got dark, simply just to survive. We don't do that. We get up and we say, what am I going to do today? We got a lot of leisure. We got a lot of time on our hands. But it was different than they simply lived to survive. When the wedding came, the married couple was treated like royalty for a whole week. And perhaps it was one of the best weeks of their entire lives. So Jesus tells his critics that his presence among his people is like that of a bridegroom among his friends. It's not a time for mourning. It's not a time for self-denial. It's not a time for sadness. It's a time for celebration and gladness. To be sad, to mourn, and to fast while the Lord was present would be out of character with what the Lord was doing in those days. Now, there's a couple of lessons here that we can glean from this verse. The Jews, because of their legalistic religious approach to things, were caught up in their rituals and their traditions, that they missed the blessed reality right before them. Had they known, had they any clue whatsoever who Jesus was, they would have ceased their fasting and joined in on the feasting. But they were clueless. And sometimes you and I and our church today and our culture, we are guilty of the same thing. In other words, we do the church thing out of habit and fail to recognize the presence of God that is with us all the time. I'll ask this question every once in a while. How real is Jesus to you? How real is the presence of God residing inside of you right now? How real is that to you? If we could ever learn to recognize his constant presence with us, the realness of his nearness, it would transform every moment of our lives. You would brush your teeth different. Woo-hoo, thank you. I mean, if you really realized that he was with you 24/7, when you pillowed your head, when you woke up in the night, when you got up, when you was restless, when you're getting ready to face the day, when you're facing the day. He's with you constantly. You get in the car, you pull out of your driveway. Jesus is right there with you. An awesome thing to think about. It would transform our every moment. I think that if we practice the nearness of Christ in our lives, we would cease our growling. We would cease our complaining. And our steps would be a little higher and a little swifter. And we would go through life with a little bit more joy and a lot more smiles. We would see a change in the way we came to church. We would come expecting his presence. And we would come to worship. The question has always been, how real is Jesus to you? The fasting of the Jews may have impressed those who saw them, but it did not impress the Lord. He knew their hearts. He knew they were not seeking him, and he knew that they were still trapped in their sins because they was missing the mark, and that's what sin is. Sometimes we need to challenge ourselves with that situation. What is sin? Sin is missing the mark. How good am I today in hitting the bullseye for what I know Christ would have me do? They were missing the mark. They were sinning. The good things we do in the name of religion and worship are nothing but hypocrisy if they are not done out of a heart that is sincerely seeking the Lord. We know he's with us. How often do we seek his presence? How often do we commune with the neighbor in our heart as we ought to? How often do we just kind of sup and eat from the manna from heaven that is residing within us, the Holy Spirit, God, Jesus Christ, always with us constantly. Now, Christ gives an explanation, And then he gives an expectation on this first parable here about the wedding. This is what we can expect. He said, the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. Having set the record straight about why they're not fasting the way they're fasting, Jesus tells all those that are listening that there's going to come a day when the bridegroom will be taken away. And on that day, his disciples will fast and they'll be sorrowful. The phrase "is taken away" speaks of a sudden removal. And Jesus is referring to the day when he will be taken away and he'll be crucified. The disciples had no idea of what was going on. They didn't realize what he was saying, but that's what Christ was saying. In that dark and dreadful day, his followers will mourn and they won't have much of an appetite. He says that day will come. But for now, the disciples of the Lord were right to be excited and joyful in his presence. When the Lord is present, the people are to acknowledge him with singing, with shouting, with feasting, with a joy in the heart. If we ever got hold of that truth, it would revolutionize our walk with God. Dead, dusty traditions do not honor the Lord. And we would do well to look for ways to express our excitement and joy over who he is and what he has done for us. In other words, think outside the box a little bit. For example, when was the last time you just sat down for a meal with your husband, with your wife, maybe with family, and you just simply said, honey, kids, today I just want to testify to you that I am so thankful that in your father's heart, or in your husband's heart, or in your wife's heart, or in your mother's heart, there is someone that leads me and guides me in everything that is true and right. And I just want to let you know that I'm so happy about the presence of God in our home. It's really what's going on. It's what's taking place. Christ is with you. And we should talk about that. We should look for ways outside the box in ways to worship the Lord. We don't have to be in church singing a song or listening to a message or hearing a testimony. All those things are good. But look for opportunities to worship God in the everyday settings of your life. On your job, be thankful that you have an employer that's willing to pay you as an employee, that you can pay the bill and maybe put a little bit back and do some things with. Be thankful for that. Lord, I just want to worship you today for this job. I want to thank you for it. A lot of folks don't have this. I want to worship you. I want to thank you. I know you're right with me. Number 3, Jesus and his revelation. He wants to make his point crystal clear. Crystal clear simply means there's no denying what I'm about to say here. And Jesus uses 2 parables, 2 vivid illustrations from everyday life. Like I said, we want to kind of have Jesus with us in everyday life. He wants the Jews to understand that he did not come to preach a new and an improved Judaism. He wants them to know that he did not come to reupholster their worn-out religion. Your favorite chair is history. We're not going to fix that. He wants them to know that he has come to do away with the old and bring about something entirely new. He wants them to know that their religion, their rituals, and their rules have absolutely no place with what he came to accomplish. Well, it's just amazing how Jesus can bring this to their minds and to their hearts with just a question, why aren't you fasting? But it opens the door for him to present who he is and why he's here. Jesus wants these people to know that what he is doing and what they are doing is so different that they can never be connected. This is what he wanted to tell them about this fasting and the rituals. He wants them to get the message that his gospel cannot be contained within the confines of their religion. Jesus did not come to refurbish Judaism. He came to establish Christianity. And we need to keep that in mind as we reestablish what Christ has established to the culture that we live in today, that there is a difference between how the world lives and how religious people that want to affirm live, and what those who have been born of the Spirit of God, how we live. There is a difference, and there's going to be contention. You're going to rub the world. You're going to rub traditions. You're going to rub rituals. You're going to rub the religious elite of today. Jesus came to establish Christianity. So he gives two illustrations in two parables. The first one is the illustration of clothes. He says in Mark 2:21, he says, no one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the patch tears away from it, and the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. Now, that would lose itself in today's young ladies, or young men if they were sewing, because we just don't do it no more. If I have something got a hole in it, I just throw it away and buy a new one. It's wore out. Well, the first illustration Jesus uses one that they would have all been very familiar with. In that day, clothes were not thrown out when they became worn or they became torn. And most of us think nothing about throwing out old clothes when they have become worn or torn. But I am sure that there are some of us here, and myself included, that we can remember, especially when I was a child, having to wear hand-me-down clothes that our mothers would patch and work on so that we could get one more school year out of them, because our family couldn't afford to buy a new set of clothes for 4 or 5 kids every year. You couldn't do it. When I was a kid, one of the biggest things on our list going back to school, and it was a big deal, we would go to, how many remembers Pickway? Pickway was a shoe store on 4th Street in Mansfield. And I think they prided themselves 2 pairs for $5, something like that. But we would all go there, and we would pick out a pair of shoes, and that was to last us for the school year. And I remember when the Beatles were famous, and they had what they called Beatle shoes. Beatle shoes were shoes that was really pointed at the toe. And I remember in 5th grade, 6th grade, I wanted a pair of those Beatles shoes. Mom thought they was hideous and ugly. And if you really wanted to be cool, you had a pair of Beatles shoes, and you put a tap on the heel. So when you walked down the hall, it would make a tap. And it was cool. It was hard to put taps in your shoes and then dig them back out before you got home. So I quit doing that. But there come a time when Mom let me get my first pair of Beatle shoes. But they were supposed to last us through the school year. And all of us kids in there were getting our shoes. But the situation in the people's clothes that Christ was talking to, they were the ones that they patched their old clothes the best they could. They got the most wear out of them that they possibly could get out of them, and they knew what Jesus was talking about. If a person took a torn and worn garment and sewed a new piece of cloth as a patch, first time it got wet and dried, the new piece of cloth would shrink. When it did, it would pull apart the older and the weaker garment, and the whole would be worse than what it was. Now, the spiritual principle was not lost on these Pharisees, because it was very clear. The old cannot be blended with the new. Judaism, with its external rituals and rules, could not contain Christianity with its emphasis on an internal relationship with God. Jesus, he came to fulfill the law and deliver his people from the bondage of man-made rules and rituals. Now, there were some in the very early church who tried to sew Christianity into the cloth of Judaism. These men were called Judaizers, or Judaizers. They taught that salvation was possible only when a person believed on Jesus and kept the law too. They taught that you had to believe the gospel, but you also had to be circumcised. You had to obey the dietary laws. You had to live like a Jew. They taught that Christianity was an extension of what God ordained in the beginning to Judaism, the name that they had called this religion. But Christ is saying even the best religious works of the best Jews were nothing more than moth-eaten garments, and they're rotten in the sight of God. Jesus came to give lost men a robe of righteousness that will allow them to stand complete and whole in the sight of God. In spite of our shortcomings, in spite of our mistakes, our mess-ups, this robe of righteousness that Christ gives us, it's an imputed righteousness. Bob, we're righteous because he is righteous, and we are a reflection of him, and his mercy towards us is everlasting. I'm glad for the grace of God. I'm glad that I'm able to stand whole and complete in the sight of God. I don't have to worry about doing rituals, traditions that I might impress God. The only way I can impress God is to show him Jesus. As I walk, as I talk, as I preach, as I do, I need to show him Jesus. If I'm not showing him Jesus, I'm not impressing God one bit. God's impressed by Jesus. It's Christ alone. We had the illustration of the clothes. Now he brings one more illustration. He wants them to get this point. And it's the illustration of the containers. It continues here and he says, and no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins. And the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins. But new wine is for fresh wineskins. Now, this illustration Jesus uses here, all would have understood who heard what he had just said. Jesus uses an image of wine bottles. Now, glass and plastic bottles, they did not exist in those days. Ancient people often used the skin of a goat as a container for their wine. I did a little research on this, and I thought, my wife would never have stood for this. Marcia is just so picky about certain things, and she would not have enjoyed the fact that when a goat got killed, the skin was cut around the neck and the legs, and it was pulled off the body in one piece. The leg openings would be sewed shut and sealed. And what had been the goat's neck is now used as a spout. Now the hide would be partially tanned. Then this hide would be used as a wine bottle or a wine skin. The hide at this time was very elastic and would expand as the wine began to ferment. Now, in time, these wineskins, they would dry out and they would become very brittle. Now, they could be used for water and different things, but if new wine was poured into an old wineskin and it began to ferment, the old wineskin did not have the elasticity to expand, and it wouldn't be able to stretch to accommodate the gases that the fermenting wine was putting off, and they would burst. The wine and the wineskins both would be lost. Now, here's these Pharisees listening to Jesus and his disciples of John. Again, the spiritual application here is very clear. Judaism, with its rituals and rules, could not contain the ministry and the message of Jesus Christ. He did not come to pour the new wine of his Spirit into the hearts that were trying to please God by keeping rules and the traditions of men. Jesus came to give new life to lost sinners, and I'm thankful for that. When he was transformed, he transformed us through the new birth, and we are ready to receive the new wine of his Spirit. And the only one who has been saved by grace is born, the one that's born again, is fit to contain the Spirit of God. If you have not been born again, you cannot contain the Spirit of God. It will not work. Have you ever noticed those beautiful oak trees? An oak tree, unlike other trees, during the course of the winter, they don't lose all their leaves. Matter of fact, some of them, it looks like they're in full leaf right through the winter. The dead brown leaves just kind of hang on the limbs until spring comes. And when spring comes, the sap rises in the tree, and the new buds begin to push out from the end of the branches, and the old leaves are forced to fall away. The new life in the tree expands and causes that which is dead to fall away. Now, once we're saved and we allow the Holy Spirit to work in our lives, Bob, we're a lot like those old oak trees. We hang on to things. I was raised up in a very legalistic church, and there were certain things we hung on to. We just hung on to them. We felt that they made us better Christians. And they were nothing more than legalism, traditions of men. One brother, I believe he loved the Lord. I believe he was saved. I believe he's going to heaven. But, you know, as they say in the South, God bless his soul. God bless his heart. You know, he would preach that men wearing short sleeve shirts were sinning against God because we should have our arms covered. He really believed that. And a lot of men that liked him began to wear long sleeve shirts because they didn't want to be offensive to God. And that's just one example of a whole list of things that I could point out to you. See, when we're born again, we're saved, we're born into a culture, we're born into a church, we're born into a religion. And religions aren't the gospel. But the Bible is. We take the Bible, and as we grow and we mature, and the Spirit of God is put in this new growth, it begins to force away that which is old. It cannot. And all of us at times are challenged by that. Okay, is this really what God is wanting, or is this something I'm kind of hanging on to for whatever reason? Well, that's exactly what Jesus does in our lives. The old ways of sin and self-will, they hang on for as long as they can. Religion, religious rituals, and the traditions of men will not repair your old man. These things merely hold him down for just a little while. And when Jesus moves in and he has his way, he creates a new life within us. And this new life he places in us begins to work its way out of who we were and what God is wanting us to become. And before long, what the Lord has done on the inside becomes very clear on the outside as he changes the old man into a new creature for the glory of the Lord. The new wine of Jesus will burst the wineskin of the old man on the outside. This old flesh cannot contain the work of God in the heart. I remember times when my old wineskin was burst, and the freedom and the joy that I experienced because of that into my new growth. He stretches us to new limits. The inner pressure of his presence displaces unneeded things and fills every area of our lives. And this new life, it's so powerful, it's so dynamic and so different that the old wineskins of religion and traditions and the old ways of living must give way to the new life that he places in you and I. It just has to. We're not satisfied with nothing more than Christ. Nothing less than Christ would be a more proper way to say it. So, it's like an acorn. Let's go back and revisit this oak here a little bit. You can take a rock, or you can take a hammer, and I've done this. Inside an acorn is just kind of gooey, greeny stuff. The new ones, it's just, there's a lot more than that going on if you to break it down and examine it. But you can smash it. Or you can plant that same acorn and let it germinate into an oak. Either way, that acorn is destroyed. And either way, the old Kevin is going to be destroyed. But if you smash it, talking about the acorn, it's gone forever. But if it grows into an oak and dies to self, it has achieved its fullest potential. Jesus comes to enable us to live out God's perfect will through the power of the Holy Ghost. He places His prescription within our hearts and helps us to achieve God's best in our lives. Isn't that just a beautiful old oak tree? 650 years old. What if that acorn would have said, oh, I don't know. There's going to be a lot of storms come through this field. I just don't know if I want to grow or not. It's going to be a lot of winters I'm going to have to endure. There may be some folks come by and just cut me down. I just don't know if it's worth it. But the acorn died to self and became a majestic, beautiful oak tree in Poland. How about you? Are you growing? Are you becoming what God purposed you to become? Are you going to reach a majestic, full potential for the cause of Christ? He comes to enable us by grace to live our lives to the glory of God. To spread abroad the fame of who He is to those who's witness to our lives and how we live. Rick Warren said, living for God's glory is the greatest achievement we can accomplish with our lives. So in conclusion, Jesus did not come to blend His new way with old ways of living and believing. Jesus came to redeem sinners and to give them new life in Him. It's not just about having a new life and running helter-skelter wherever you like to go. It's in Him. There's a roadmap. There's a process. That's why salvation is referred to as a new birth. Far too many are trying to sew the patch of Christianity into the old garment of their lives, and it will not work. Jesus does not want to remodel our life. He does not want to remodel our church. He wants to make us into a brand new creature. Too many want Jesus to fill the wineskins of their old belief system. They want Jesus, but they don't want all the changes that He brings. And that won't work either. You cannot mix Jesus and your religion. You cannot mix Jesus and your old way of living. When Jesus comes in, the changes He makes are so expansive, so powerful, and so explosive that they totally destroy the old and leave only the new. That's just how it works. Sierra, I put a little bit of this on Facebook last part of the week, and she had been playing around with something and come up with something she thought would go with the message. So this is from Alabama. The unique purpose that's been planted deep within our souls far supersedes any pain you'll have as you grow. Sierra's experiencing some tremendous insight in areas that she is having to adjust to. And you take a man or a woman that is truly giving their hearts and lives over to God. When you adjust to things, even though they may be uncomfortable, God uses those. The unique purpose that's been planted deep within your soul far supersedes any pain you'll have as you grow. So I thank God for her sending that this way. If you like to write down, feel free to do so. She really shares some beautiful things. But the message today is to allow Jesus Christ to have freedom in your life to do what he's calling you to do. Don't look at how big it is. Don't look at how small it is. Just simply step into it. Simply step into it. And God's grace will supply the needs, give you the power, help you to do what needs to be done so the world can look back and say, wow, look at that. How could that possibly have come about? God's grace is the only question, the only answer that can come to that question. We're going to ask you to stand.